I'm going to do two things. One is the presentation you're going to see, I presented when I was at Hewlett Packard to Cannes. And Cannes has a big film festival. They also have a big marketing, advertising, global festival. And I presented it. I've updated the information on it. But it was really to talk to all of the marketers and creative people around the world who are assembled there in the summer to say, the world is changing. The world as we know it is changing. And it's impacting a lot of things. And it starts with society. It starts with population. It starts with growth. It has a lot to do with technology and a lot to do with information. And why is that important and relevant to all of you is your students are really facing what is going to be one of the more complicated times in society, and certainly one of the more complicated global issues that we will ever face as a country and a nation. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you hear a lot about people talking about healthcare, education, energy, natural resources, sustainability. And a lot of people don't have context for, well, why is that? Well, what we know today is that the infrastructures that were built for the last 100 years will not map to the next 100. And that has to do with migration, has to do with population explosion, and it has to do with then the demands that are going to be put on those aging infrastructures. So you're right outside New York City. New York City is one of the oldest infrastructures. So a lot of what they're trying to face right now is how are we going to provide energy? How are we going to sustain society in this city that we live in? And a lot of what we did, so I'll give you a little background, is I spent 17 years at the Walt Disney Company, but I moved around with them. So I spent 4 years in Paris, about another 3 years in Hong Kong and China, opening up what were resorts and parks around the world, as well as spent about 13 of those years as president of the studio for motion pictures, music, and TV. And certainly saw what technology was doing to content, consumption, communication, and information, and how it really changed the definition of mass communication as we knew it, or as when I went to school I was trained in. And so for me, when the opportunity came after 17 years of working with Disney, working around the world, to go to Hewlett Packard, the largest IT company in the world, as their chief marketing officer, it was an opportunity that I didn't want to turn down. I spent almost 4 years there doing that, traveled the world with our CEO, and certainly saw and met with many of the big public companies and governments. So we worked in the public sector, which is where we were actually finding solutions for some of these issues you're going to see, and how technology would play a role, and the roles it was playing relative to sustainability, to helping meet some of these needs and these demands. And we really believe that technology was the most valuable resource, maybe with the exception of gold today, is the most valuable resource in the 21st century. And that has to do a lot with the impact it will have as you think about power and water, as you think about a lot of the utilities we need, the consumption rate, and where that will go, and how technology and software particular, how software will play an incredible role. And you're seeing this movement, and you're hearing a lot in the press about software, and I'll give you one example, and then we'll get into the presentation. But for instance, Detroit Power and Water is the third largest power and water utility in the United States. We went in and just applied software and algorithms as we studied sort of consumption to the supply and the demand. And that was all the way from the meter to actually the plant itself. We reduced their inefficiency by over 35%, and we actually increased their profitability by, I think it was around 27%. So you're conserving, and you're just using software to understand behavior. You can understand flow. You can understand supply and demand. You can understand a lot of things. We call that business process optimization that you can't see and you can't do real time as a human being. Technology can do it almost instantaneously. You're seeing a lot of that happen in technology that many of you use in Amazon. Amazon uses incredible mathematics, and I'll be a big preacher of math and science here today. They use algorithms and math to actually understand and pattern your behavior. And they know exactly what and how to serve to you to get you to buy. And so you're seeing a lot more of this. So we were big proponents of several things. One was IT. Big believer I still am. I'm now currently at Lipman, which is a private equity firm that actually invests in disruptive, innovative companies. And some of those are consumer products companies, some of them are tech companies. One of the companies we purchased was Lipman. Lipman was an advertising agency, conventional, that's been around since 1927. It was the first agency that actually started to brand all the hotels in Miami Beach, so the Delano, et cetera. So they go way back pre-Depression. You come all the way forward. When we purchased them, they were very, very big and very well known in the luxury category. So the LVMHs, the Burberrys, the David Yurmans, the De Beers, et cetera. We've now transformed that into what is a state-of-the-art digital agency. So one that just really studies social commerce, tablet commerce, e-commerce, mobile commerce, and how technology will impact brands and services, and how companies then actually brand themselves and sell themselves. So that's what we're doing today. But what I wanted to do is not really focus on that as much as focus on the world, because a lot of us believe we know the world well. And Courtney and I always talk, and when I was at HP, we would meet with the Undersecretary of Education. We did a lot in the public sector with the government, whether it was with the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Navy, or the Education Department as it relates to technology. And we really felt that the one area, and it gets very complicated in education, that was missing was that the private sector had used technology to its advantage and had moved really rapidly, some industries more than others, into the technology space and using it to their advantage. And I always argued that one of the most important verticals is education, and yet it's the laggard. So as you think about technology and you think about how to use it in teaching, and I'll give you one example. We did a study, I believe it was with Clarion University when I was at HP, and it was the use of technology in teaching and its effectiveness. And we took a calculus course, and we deployed technology into the calculus course. And this was interactive technology where the teacher could actually real-time interface with the students and could teach and see. And she taught using a board and using laptop, just notebook computers that each person in the class were given. The test scores went up over 40%, and the dropout rate in calculus went down over 50%. So we continued to do more studies like this. So that's just one example of how interactivity and how technology can be used to actually really see a class of maybe 40 people real time and be able to interface and catch things and correct things real time. There's examples, and that's just one example, of how you use telepresence technology or how you bring people into the classroom now and how connected you are around the world and the access you have. So for somebody such as yourselves who maybe lecture, or some of you who maybe have written books and you go on tour, you can only physically cover so many geographic areas, and you only have so much time in your day. And what does become important is the ability for you to bring people in of note to your classroom. And that becomes incredibly easy today because as you think about where technology has gone, the latency you once had in telepresence technology is gone. So today you can real time have a conversation with somebody. And so as you start to think about, well, how are we using technology in the classroom and how do we use it in education? It really has lagged most of the other industries, and yet it's one of the most important, really to the future and the health of our citizens and the kids who will be our future leaders. And so as a part of society, one of the big things we focused on was really trying to do that. So you'll find that the Bill and Melinda Gates organization and foundation really went after rural education. And how do we bring technology and access into those classrooms? HP actually partnered up and believes in the same thing. How do we go out and help bringing technology in to connect people, to give them access to information? As you know, information is very important. So those are some of the things we thought about, but it was all in context of what I'm going to show. And I could do a PowerPoint, and then we can sit up here and talk, but I thought what I would do is I put it into a video format. It's about 6.5 minutes, and it's going to share with you some of those things that you need to think about that will impact your students. We are in a global economy. We're in a global world. You know, we've seen that with the meltdown of the financial crisis, the impact it has. You can't disconnect one market from another. So we really are global, and you need that global perspective. And so we'll start with this, and then I'm happy to come back and do Q&A. So that just gives you context. There are 4 trends that really Silicon Valley and most, I would say, marketers and companies in general are looking at. And a lot of people tend to get caught in the brand and the hype around a given brand. I see some of you, well, a lot of you actually have Apples here. We really try to stay away from any kind of form factor. So we really try to be agnostic as you think about devices. So what I mean by that is the one trend, and you saw the numbers up here, becomes incredibly important is mobility. The idea that you're always connected. You wake up, you're connected. You go to sleep, you're connected. The form factor of the device is not necessarily what you want to trend or what you think is important. So what I mean by that is whether it's a tablet, a notebook, a smartphone, a phone, it is about mobility, and you'll continue to see that mobility plays an extraordinary, enormous role in companies and products and services that you offer, whether they're business-to-business services or whether they're business-to-consumer services, how you use them in education. Mobility will be incredibly important, and using software as a service. So I tie that to the internet is actually evolving, as you know it today. One example of that is today, search is done by you. Actually, search will be done and performed for you. And you're starting to see that with where Google is moving. You're certainly seeing it in China, and that becomes incredibly important as you think about, well, what does that mean? That means there's the software and the algorithms that people are using are going to be much more intuitive to your behaviors and context setting. So you're not going to have to sift through lists as you do a search and try to find what's quality. It will already know that. And we've already seen the beginnings of that. If you go on Google now and you do a search, it starts to already recommend some links to you before you sift down through all of the links that it provides on page 1, page 2, page 3. So mobility, very, very important. The biggest thing in mobility that you want to pay attention to is your operating systems. So this has to do with the fact that you have certainly Apples, you have WebOS, you have Android. You certainly had RIM. We'll see whether they make it or not. You'll continue to see some consolidation. I always say that Apple does an unbelievable job in branding. It lives a little larger in your mind. Android's outpacing the Apple operating system in apps almost 2-to-1 today. So really pay attention to the operating systems that they're on and that software that's running it and where the app developers are actually migrating to. Those will be the biggest platforms that actually exist relative to software as a service, which leads you to understand that everything will be delivered as a service through software. It's where cloud computing will take us as you think about the cloud is really just a data center somewhere that you're actually storing information to. That actually will give you more insights. And whether they're business insights or consumer insights, those insights become incredibly important. So you will see a shift as you think about the skill sets needed in business today, in government today, no matter really almost what vertical sector you go into, statistics and analytics will become incredibly important because there's data, as you think about raw data, in that raw data you can pull extraordinary insights out. What do I mean by that? For instance, businesses today look at price elasticity, the prices of their products and what is the mean price point and how much elasticity do they have to that price point and when should they discount and when shouldn't they. This is about then profitability and margins for organizations, so it becomes incredibly important that they understand how to look at raw data and how to pull the analytics out of raw data. So again, math becomes an incredibly important discipline for people to have a great foundation as they start to look at and go to school. The other trend is social and community. So this idea of amplification of word of mouth, connectivity, the idea that there's nowhere to hide today, that transparency is incredibly important. We did several studies in this area with some scientists and fellows at HP. One of the things that we learned was that what you would believe as a barometer for success relative to influence would be how many Twitter followers do you have if you take a social setting like that, and that quantity then necessitates influence, which is not true. So what we found is the amount of followers you have on Twitter does not necessitate influence. So there are other mechanisms within Twitter that you can actually use that actually behaviorally will tell you who is an influencer on Twitter and who is not. And so again, that type of software going in and sifting through will help companies. But social and amplification becomes incredibly important. 60% today of a person's website, as you think about e-commerce or engagement, is coming through side doors. And what I mean by that is they're not coming in on your landing page. They're actually coming right into their search results, and they're clicking in very deep into your site. So it becomes incredibly important that you're prepared and you understand the fact that Facebook, a social site, is actually becoming incredibly important to the viability of a product and service, the reputation of your company, and doing commerce. So those sites become incredibly important. You will see them evolve. So each of those sites are going to be evolving to where they're going to have a piece of commerce. So you're going to now see commerce go into the social space in a very robust way. We're certainly seeing that with Twitter. We've seen it with Google, and Facebook will be sort of the next. So that becomes important. And then the third is sort of this idea of know me and be relevant to me, personalization and customization. So as a generation, we tend to be somewhat concerned about privacy. The studies show really as you go down through and you go even into the millennials and you go younger, that they do not have this issue. They will share things. So this is a generational issue. People share, they communicate, they engage, and it will become incredibly important that you know these people, that you're relevant to them, that you don't waste their time, that you're simple, and you get them to their answers quickly. You get them to what they're looking for quickly. So there's a little bit less patience involved with certain generations relative to this because their expectations are very high. And then the fourth is what I call global citizenship, and that really encompasses a lot. That has to do with ethics and governance of your company. It has to do with sustainability. It has to do with your labor and human rights practices as a brand or a company and or an organization. This just doesn't go for people who are selling things. So as you move through generations, that becomes incredibly important. If you don't build that in as a foundation to what you're doing as a company now, you are going to be left behind because as we again move through the generations, the younger we get, the more the expectations are in this space. So you're going to see a lot of people focus on this. And with the democratization of the internet and the complete transparency of the internet, it's an area that you can't hide. This old idea of greenwashing doesn't exist anymore. I mean, you're found out very quickly. So those are the four things that big organizations and people are tending to focus on, including the public sector. This sort of sheds light some of these data points that we are connected globally, that there's a part of the world that's growing faster as you think about, macroeconomies and you start to think about the symbiotic relationships between different countries and different economies. It's really a blend. And so what's happening in Europe right now with the banks and the fact that they did not recapitalize their infrastructure 3 years ago when the US banks did will have an impact on this economy and will have an impact on the Asian economy. So it is completely interconnected. These are important facts because they're going to start to dictate where people's focuses are. And I think it's something that becomes relevant for your students and for yourselves as you think about you're really building careers for these students in a lot of different verticals, a lot of different sectors. And I think this will help you sort of guide where the emphasis should be. Okay, so a good question. The biggest issue companies who are selling on the internet products and services today is an integrated approach. We're not seeing that people are watching any less, they're watching it differently. It was very interesting. It was as if an interesting study was done where, and this is just sort of a parallel, on printing. When people came up with digital photography, people were concerned that printing would go down, there'd be less printing, which was not the case actually. It actually is going up, it's actually growing based on digital photography. So the idea is they're not watching any less, they're watching it differently. So you're starting to see people and younger generations consume that same content that's offline, online. And so they're starting to buy and consume, whether it's Hulu, whether it's through iTunes, they're watching it differently. They're also multitasking when they're doing it. So you're going to find as you go through generations, you'll have somebody watching TV who's already online and is searching for stuff and is looking at stuff and they're multitasking. You'll see somebody on a phone who's actually watching TV. You think they're distracted and they're multitasking against the different screens. So it becomes more connected, but we don't see any less consumption in the content, and we also don't see any we don't see a less discerning audience. So what I mean by that is a lot of people said, oh, what's going to happen to professional content because there's all this user-generated. People still find and discern to the best content, whether it's professional or user-generated. They will find the best content. So those are some of those patterns. Then as it relates to actually commerce, and you said, you know, if you're in a global community, will you offer the same thing? The actual movement is to offer you based on who you are, not based on mass customization. So a lot of people thought personalization, customization was sort of this mass. We have a demographic, we have a target, we have a like set of people that we're targeting. They all get one image. Then we have another group over here, and that could be economic, it could be cultural, it could be race, it could be ethnicity, et cetera, right? Today, they'll target you directly. So just like Amazon is incredibly good at watching what you're doing and studying your behaviors and offering you things, most companies are moving in that direction to where they'll know your preferences and know your history. And they're going to know then how to quickly get you sifting through. Because what they also know is when they don't do that, you tend to come in and you look and you become a looky-loo, really, and you get overwhelmed, and you opt out of the site, so you have an abandonment rate that goes high, and the ability for them to capture you again and to convert you to sale is that much more difficult, and usually doesn't happen. So they know that while you're in their environment, they've got to try to convert you. So they will study you, and they will know if you're looking for design, they will know if you're looking for function, and they will know if you're looking for value or price. And so if you've ever been on those sites and you see a pop-up ad right before you click out, they know you were going to do that because they've seen that behavior before. And so they offer you something. Hey, have you thought about this at 25% off, right? And they'll try to convert you. So the idea is to really try to capture you, keep you in that environment, and convert you. And then you'll also know that they'll upsell and cross-sell to you. So as you think about shopping in that environment, it's really one about what are your preferences, what are you selecting? Most people selected this, may select that. We're going to make that offer to you. And they'll try to convert you and upsell and cross-sell you into other things you didn't intend to buy. So I'm no longer with HP, so it's been about a year. So I'm not in the middle of that. What I can tell you is that what they understand is the importance of software as a service. And you'll see that in the public sector. You'll see it in almost every vertical, whether it's financial services, travel and tourism, media entertainment, you know, the public sector, that software becomes incredibly important. And that the servicing then of that, so the building of the applications, the understanding of what your IT stack should be to create these capabilities is important. And so those two sectors, services and software, become incredibly important. Software, very important. The hardware has been commoditized, as you know. So today, as you think about the global economy, where notebooks are made and where PDAs are made or where a tablet's made, a lot of that has been commoditized. Apple was very smart, and they went very high-end. So Apple's brand is targeted to a very high-end consumer and somebody whose average household income is much higher. And they've sold you a lot on design, functionality, and the fact that they really have a closed system in their operating system. So therefore, you don't have as many viruses that can attack because it's a smaller subset of the larger PC world. So they were very smart in doing that. You know, they struggle, and they continue to struggle on the big enterprise side because it can't scale. But you're paying a premium for like product. So most people don't realize that you're paying a premium for the design and a premium for that. But that said, the hardware business runs at, you know, anywhere from 2 to 4% margins. You're lucky if you're making 6%. And so the idea is, do you really want to be in that business? Or do you really want to go where cloud computing is going to take you? And a great company to study relative to software as a service and cloud computing and the applications that they are providing to educators, to businesses, to small, medium-sized businesses is Salesforce. What is it? Salesforce. And it was started by a guy in Silicon Valley. It has become enormous. Oracle tried to buy them, I think, for about $4 billion. They did not sell. But watch what they do to Oracle, to the HPs of the world relative to software. HP knows this, and they've got to play heavier in the software business than they have. I think HP's software business was only about 5% of the market, very small. So I think they know they have to move the company in that direction quickly. Just the importance of math and science in this country. We've seen a decline in those degrees coming out of college, and we've seen an uptick in Asia. We've seen, an uptick in Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of concern around where we will find that talent, that future talent, when you think about the importance of the role it's going to play in society, right, as well as in how we do business, how we connect. And so it does become incredibly important that we have innovators. And I think the idea that, for me, and more personal than anything, is math and science as a track are important, but the idea of free thinking and innovation. We cannot lose our innovation edge as a country, and that's innovation in every vertical. And I think if you can instill the idea of creative thinking, of innovation, and encouraging kids, especially within those tracks, it becomes important. And so, as you see some of these programs and these solutions, people are trying to bring attention to math and science. It becomes important, I think, to the health of the country.
Could you speak a little bit about emerging nations and technology and what drives, whether you're talking about China or India or Brazil?
Yeah. So when I was at HP, we did business in about 183 countries, and most people considered the BRIC, or Brazil, India, Russia, China, as the emerging countries. For us, those had emerged. They have actually had built the infrastructures. We were actually moving into the Middle East. We were moving very rapidly into the Baltic states and into parts of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, et cetera. So for us, those were sort of the emerging markets and emerging economies. That doesn't mean for other, I would say, other organizations that the BRICS become incredibly important to the marketplace. Certainly we've seen through this financial crisis where there is stability in certain markets, even though they have some high inflation. Brazil certainly has done incredibly well, will continue to. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they were very fortunate when you think about, well, so they got the World Cup, so they have the Olympics going to Brazil. What that means is there is an extraordinary amount of capital being infused into the marketplace, and that will develop that country very rapidly. And so, for them, it's not as much about having the event as what they know it will do to the microeconomy within Brazil. So those markets become incredibly important. Certainly we see in Russia a fluctuation relative to the price of oil per barrel, and as that fluctuates, you see wealth, but certainly their wealth is more dispersed. The middle class has grown. Overall, the middle class is a huge segment that's growing globally. And this is where you see access to capital, access to credit, and this is where you see, through Moore's Law, the declination of price points in technology. There'll be more access then to that technology. So we do see some of those economies somewhat stable, if you can say there's a stable economy in the world today, I would say, but certainly ones to watch. I will tell you, when we talked about China, and I did a lot of business with China, one of the things that we had heard was that there was a tremendous amount of social unrest in the very rural areas of China, and that we weren't hearing about that the world wasn't hearing about it. And then I had spent some time with Condoleezza Rice, and we had a conversation about China, and this is when I was back at HP. And again, she was talking about one of the biggest threats to them is, the economic engine and how fast the economy was growing through this industrial stage for them, and the amount of people that were having access, and the amount of people that were moving into urban areas and having access and a taste of what would be considered that middle-class lifestyle. And that should the world economy, so the Western world, slow down, which it is, and consumption starts to slow down, it puts extraordinary pressure on that growth engine. And what we've heard and seen is that some of those people that were in urban areas in China were being asked to move back to the rural areas, and that there's a tremendous amount of social unrest in that space. And so, you know, as you think about how connected we are globally, that's just one instance of some of the issues that they're dealing with that will have impact. And the reason I say that is, out of any recessionary period or depression that the Western world has seen, generally when we come out of those recessions or depressions, we see a consumption rate, and I'll give you an example, we see a consumption rate of about 7% or something. Today it's half of that. So if it was 4% coming out, it would be 2%. So we're half the consumption rate, which means there's a slowdown in goods that are being ordered from China, as China being one of the major importers. So, you know, you're watching this and you just say it is a very connected world, it's a very global world, and what happens in one space will impact another. And there was a lot of question about what will China do as the largest debt holder to the US. And really, you know, some of us who were discussing this said, well, there's not much they can do. They cannot afford for the US economy to fail. We're the largest consumer in the world, and they know this. So all they want is discipline around our budget so we don't wind up in a fragile state, because it will slow down their growth, and they will have extraordinary inflation, and they will have social unrest. And so it is that delicate when you start to think about how interconnected we are. A lot of the studies that have been done about people and what attracts people to a company. Most people think it would be what you're paid. And in fact, that's not the number one reason you would go work for a company. And any study shows that it is not that, really. That what's more important is leadership mentorship, right? And whether you're learning. Most people really value that. And then certainly it becomes about, am I compensated then for my contributions, et cetera? And then it becomes about the environment, et cetera. So it's not the number one thing on someone's mind. And so I think any company, and including Hewlett Packard when we were there, really has to value the company, its people, and the culture they've built. Some of it goes to excess, I will say, to where as a public company, you have shareholders and you have an obligation and fiduciary duty to the shareholders. And if you're an investor of that, you don't want it to go to the extreme. And I've seen the extreme where, you know, everything's paid for. You basically could live at work for free. They offer you dry cleaning, health services, all your meals, all your laundry. They create an environment where you have a hammock. And literally, I went into one company and I was like, do these college graduates go home ever? And a lot of what some of those companies have done that you read about, it isn't really for the employee base as much as they know, if I keep that engineer here for 3 hours longer, I get that much more work out of the pipeline. So why not provide him all these services, because these benefits actually outweigh what I'm getting in the upside and productivity. So I've seen the extreme, but I think more and more companies, again, relative to the transparency that exists today, are very focused on the employee base. And if they're not, they will be in trouble. And I think that's important. The other thing I think that's important, though, is as you think about companies, Disney, HP, that have heritage, 75 years, 80 years, that the idea, the spirit of those founders, Bill and Dave, was one that was risk-taking. They bet everything. They bet their personal life, their income, everything on ideas. They were inventors and they were innovative. Walt Disney bet everything against the idea that I would be the first person to bring interactivity to entertainment. Most people think that the theme park was just an amusement park, but his idea was you're seeing films in a passive way, and it's not participatory. And I'm going to create an environment that actually takes you into the dimension and makes it interactive. So the first interactive entertainment came from him. Now that leads to gaming and everything else, but if you think back what they were trying to accomplish, but they bet everything, they were risk takers. So that's part one, and then part two is they believed in performance. So speed, quick, innovate, take risks, fail and fail fast. That was one of the mottos at HP, was fail and fail fast. and learn from it. Don't take a long time to fail, right? So don't take a long time. So I think that those cultures become important, but when you think about a company that has heritage, a lot of times you try to go back in a moment in time and recreate a moment in time, and you build a museum out of your organization, and there's no relevancy. So I think you really have to be careful that you pull the attributes of what an organization stood for and what the culture was, and you make it relevant today. And I think that's what HP was trying to do.
How can teachers help students to use technology appropriately and effectively to better understand what they are learning, to better connect themselves to the world, and to get the information they want?
Yeah, I think one, we talked about as a resource, it's almost infinite. So as you multi-source your information, do it from multiple locations and do it from multiple locations around the world, right? And really expose yourself to that information. But I think also what at least we've seen is then the dialogue around that information becomes important. So how are they connected to the other classmates in your classroom? And are they networked? Because a lot of you are networked with the parents and the students relative to homework assignments and curriculum and even certain schools with grades and evaluations. But the idea that even your students are connected with each other as they talk and dialogue about this. I think you went to Stanford. Stanford was very good at building those communities and those sub-communities within the classes that you stayed networked with, and they would call them study groups. Today, those study groups at Stanford are actually technology groups, so they don't have to physically meet, but they're connected at a given moment in time, and they're talking and discussing and helping each other. So I do think there's an idea of you have a study group, you don't always have to be physically present to be in that group today. The other thing was telepresence. So the idea that you can bring any expert in at any moment, and if you tell that expert it's only 15 to 20 or 30 minutes of your time today, and I want you to just talk to the students and I want them to have a Q&A, and it has to do with something that person has relevancy around or context around. And I think that becomes important because to fly people in, it costs, it takes days out of their week, and so therefore the answers are no, we can't do it. And I think if you were to ask people, do you want to help in education? Whether you're the public or the private sector, most people want to. Most people want to do something. And the problem is time, right? So they can't find the time, though. And so I think the easier you make that in the use of technology and saying, we can bring you into the classroom. Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.